this week, I want to talk about something that maybe is even scarier than sticking pins in voodoo dolls, and it's called the Master Death File. Now, this is not the name of a new novel on the New York Times bestseller list. This is not the name of a new movie that's coming out. It's the Master Death List. This is something, folks, you don't want to be on. But the federal government, by law, the Social Security Administration, has to maintain the Master Death List. And obviously, those of us on Social Security or of Social Security age are involved in this, but we don't want to see our name on that list. Because if your name is on that list, you no longer are eligible for Social Security payments because it's a death list. You've died. And so, as sinister as it sounds, it's probably necessary that we do this, that we have at least some list that lets the Social Security Administration know that it's time to stop the Social Security checks from going to dead people. The beneficiary or the recipient has died, and therefore procedures will be made so that next month's check doesn't keep rolling out, and rolling out. Now, a lot of us here in the Senate, we get on different kind of lists, voting records, awards for standing up for certain issues and policies that people respect, and I've had a number of those. One list I don't want to be on, but know that as a human being I'm sort of careening toward, is the Master Death List. But we thought, well, let's dig into this. Let's see how this works. So we went to the General Accounting Office, the Government Accountability Office, and said, what about this Master Death List stuff? And we did some investigation on that. And out of that came an example of one agency that GAO, the General Accounting Ability Office, had examined. It's the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Now, the Department of Agriculture sends out checks, payments for conservation, disaster relief, and crop subsidies. But what did we find? Well, we found that between 2008 and 2012, $27.6 million in payments for conservation, disaster relief, and crop subsidies were made to people who had died, who were deceased. And what's more disturbing is that many of those recipients had been dead for more than 2 years. And this is just one department out of all the federal agencies, the hundreds of federal agencies that issue checks for all kinds of different purposes. So it's important to have a master death list, because what we want these agencies to do, in fact, by what they are obligated to do under the law, is check the master death list to make sure that the checks aren't going to people that are on that list. Well, obviously, this one agency, Department of Agriculture, one of two things happened. Either names did not get on that list, or names were on the list, but they didn't check it. Either way, there's responsibility here for the federal government in handling taxpayer dollars to make sure that, one, those who are deceased, names get on the master death list, as scary as that is, or if they're on the list, they don't receive the payments. Now, in this digital age, it shouldn't be too hard to keep that master death list updated. Every state has records that have to be made in terms of sent by the coroner or authorized by the hospital or whatever. There are a number of sources of finding out. And particularly in the digital age, it's pretty easy to enter a name. When you get the certificate of death, enter a name, it goes into the master death list. And it ought to be relatively easy for agencies sending out checks to coordinate with that, either probably by pushing a button or going into an app or whatever, and finding out, does John Jones or Bill Smith still qualify for his Social Security payments? That ought to be pretty automatic. But unfortunately it isn't, particularly when you find that people have been receiving these checks even 2 years after they have died. So something is amiss here. Now, in the old days, you probably had to call Farmer Bob out in rural America and say, you know, Father Joe down the Farmer Joe down the road, is he still living? Have you seen him in town lately? What's happening? Did you go to the funeral? We don't have to do all that anymore. This stuff is all digitized and all very accessible. So here we are with the Social Security Administration needing to do what it needs to do to make sure that list is kept up to date. And as I say, none of us are anxious to get on that list. I see all the young pages down here saying, oh, I got a long time to go. And they're looking at this aging senator saying, well, you're a lot closer to that list than we are. I hope they're not saying that. Some of them are smiling. Nevertheless, the agencies who are issuing the checks also have to do that. Because, in a serious way, this is taking money from hard-earned tax dollars, hard-earned by people who have to make the bills paid by the end of the week, that have to cover the mortgage, have to provide for the education of their children, have to buy food at the grocery store, have to buy gas at the gas pump. People are scraping by. And when they see this kind of thing or hear about this kind of thing, they're outraged. And we're seeing that played out here in these nomination processes on both sides of the Republican and the Democrats. People are frustrated with the inefficiency and effectiveness of the federal government in the use of their tax dollars. So I'm down here to illustrate that, not to spur continued anger and outrage, but to get people seriously focused on the fact that their dollars are not being wisely spent. And they need to call their congressmen, and they need to call their senators, and they need to say, you need to do a better job in managing our money that we're sending you to protect this nation, to provide for roads, bridges, health care, and so forth. There are some essential things government needs to do, but it doesn't need to put out $331,000 for a hanger study with voodoo dolls, and it doesn't need to waste $27.6 million of checks going to people who are deceased and no longer are eligible for receiving that. So we continue to add money to our total, another $27.6 billion. $1 billion, folks, 140 million. These numbers get up there, huh? It's like the debt clock, you know. Well, this is the waste clock. It's not a clock, but this is the waste chart. $157 billion, $619,142,953, and we'll be back next week with the next edition of Waste of the Week.